What can you say at all about this and the rivalry between you and Jon?
I thought the fight was going well. I don't even know what happened. It's like I got kicked in the head. Oh man, that's so disappointing.
I want to take this time to thank Daniel Cormier for being my biggest rival and motivator. Daniel Cormier, guys, he has absolutely no reason to hang his head. He has been a model champion, a model husband, a model father, a teammate, leader.
Imagine standing on the biggest stage of your life, years of sacrifice leading to this very moment, and then, in an instant, it all crumbles. The lights blur, the cheers fade, and the taste of defeat is sharper than any punch. How do you come back from that? How do you rise when history has already written your downfall? Daniel Cormier was never supposed to be a legend. Too short, too old, too late. But fate had other plans. From tragedy to triumph, from crushing losses to unimaginable victories. His journey wasn't just about fighting inside the octagon. It was a war against destiny itself. And in that war, one name stood in his way more than any other: Jon Jones. This is the story of Daniel Cormier, and it's a story you won't forget. The fall before the rise. A warrior does not just rise, he is forged in the fires of suffering. Imagine standing in the cage, your rival's foot swinging towards your head like a guillotine. Daniel Cormier, a man of grit and heart, took that head kick from Jon Jones, crashing to the mat, his dreams shattering in front of the world. The world saw a broken fighter, tears streaming down his face. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't feel, was the weight of a past far more painful than any knockout. A loss? No, this was just another battle in a war he had been fighting since childhood. Because before the octagon, before the belts, before the cheers, there was only tragedy. A young boy in Louisiana, Daniel Cormier had already faced the kind of heartbreak that breaks lesser men. Thanksgiving 1986, he was just 7 years old when his father was gunned down. The bullet that ended his father's life was not just an act of violence. It was a sentence, sentencing young Daniel to grow up without the man who should have been his guide. Then, as if fate was testing his limits, came the unthinkable. In 2003, an 18-wheeler crushed his world. His 3-month-old daughter taken from him in an instant. There are losses, and then there are scars so deep they never heal. But this would become his fuel. Why does this keep happening? That's the question he kept asking, but soon he would stop asking and start fighting, wrestling with destiny. Pain either crushes a man or molds him into something unstoppable. For Daniel Cormier, grief became the anvil upon which he was reforged. In the darkness of his room, drowning in the loss of his daughter, he had a choice: stay buried under the weight of tragedy, or rise and make her memory his greatest weapon. And so, he chose the mat. Wrestling became his salvation, the only place where pain could be controlled, channeled, and turned into victory. He wasn't just another athlete. He was a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. But how far could he push himself before his body pushed back? The climb began. NCAA Division the Run finalist, 2-time Pan American champion, and a world-class wrestler with his sights set on Olympic gold. But fate, as cruel as ever, wasn't done testing him. Athens 2004 to Cormier stood 1 minute away from securing an Olympic bronze. Then a slip, a mistake, 3 points surrendered. The medal slipped through his fingers. 4 years later, he returned, stronger, better, only for his own body to betray him. Kidney failure. A brutal weight cut cost him his Olympic dream. The warrior who had endured so much had been stopped, not by an opponent, but by himself. Defeat was closing in. His wrestling career was over. Was this where the story ended? Failure at the Olympics could have been the end. It should have been. But Daniel Cormier had already learned that fate would never give him an easy road. With wrestling stripped from him, he stood at a crossroads. The fire inside him hadn't died. It just needed a new battlefield. And then, like a cruel twist of destiny, the sport that had once been a distant thought came knocking. Mixed martial arts. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about proving to himself, to the world, and to the ghosts of his past that he wasn't done. But there was a problem. He was already 31. Too old, too late. Or was he? The transition wasn't graceful, it was violent. Cormier, the wrestler, had to become Cormier, the fighter. American Kickboxing Academy became his new home, and Cain Velasquez, the reigning UFC heavyweight champion, became his mentor. Day after day, he was thrown to the wolves, beaten, bloodied, and tested in ways he had never known. But with every punch absorbed, with every takedown landed, something terrifying was happening. He wasn't just learning MMA. He was dominating it. The chubby wrestler, the man dismissed as too small for heavyweight, was breaking fighters who had been in the game for years, and soon the world would take notice. The relentless rise. The world didn't expect much from Daniel Cormier, a 5'11" heavyweight with a wrestler's frame. He wasn't built like the giants who ruled the division, but appearances deceive. When he stepped into the cage for his MMA debut, something primal took over. The bell rang, and within seconds it was clear. This wasn't just a wrestler trying to fight. This was a monster unleashed. His opponent crumbled under the pressure, helpless against Cormier's brutal pace. Takedowns came like tidal waves, relentless, suffocating. The ground and pound was ruthless, calculated. His debut ended in a TKO, and the world got its first taste of what was coming. But this was just the beginning. Fight after fight, Cormier's legend grew. Within 2 years, he was 8-0, leaving bodies in his wake. But then came the true test, Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. A tournament featuring some of the most feared men in the sport. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was just an alternate, a last-minute replacement for an injured fighter. But what happens when you throw a hungry wolf into a den of lions? The lions don't survive. First, he demolished Antonio Bigfoot Silva, a man who had just destroyed the legendary Fedor Emelianenko. Then in the finals, he dominated Josh Barnett, a former UFC heavyweight champion, throwing him around like a ragdoll. Daniel Cormier, once just a wrestler, was now the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix champion. The MMA world had no choice but to take notice. The question now, could anyone stop him? The heavyweight puzzle. Daniel Cormier was now a champion, but his journey was far from complete. The Strikeforce Grand Prix belt proved he was elite, but it wasn't the ultimate on prize. The UFC was calling, and so was the biggest challenge of his career. But there was a problem, a massive, unavoidable problem. The UFC's heavyweight throne was already occupied by his closest friend and training partner, Cain Velasquez. Fighting for the heavyweight title meant betraying the man who had guided him, the man who had helped shape him into the fighter he had become. Was the dream of being champion worth the price of brotherhood? The answer came swiftly. Cormier made his choice. He would walk away from the heavyweight division, leaving the title for Cain. But that didn't mean his journey was over. Instead, he would take a different, even more brutal path. He would cut down to light heavyweight and chase the man everyone feared, the undefeated, undisputed champion, Jon Jones. But before he could get to Jones, he had one final mission at heavyweight: He needed to prove he was the best big man, not named Cain Velasquez. Enter Frank Mir, a former UFC heavyweight champion. Cormier's UFC debut would be against a legend, and in the world's biggest fighting promotion, there would be no room for excuses. Making a statement. The moment had arrived. Daniel Cormier stepped into the UFC octagon for the first time. The lights brighter than ever, the expectations higher than they had ever been. Across from him stood Frank Mir, a former heavyweight champion and submission specialist. Mir had seen it all, fought the best, and finished legends. But Cormier? Cormier was an unstoppable force just waiting to be recognized. From the opening bell, it was clear he wasn't just here to win, he was here to dominate. He trapped Mir against the cage, suffocating him with dirty boxing and relentless pressure. Every time Mir tried to escape, Cormier was there, grinding him down, making him feel every ounce of his presence. 15 minutes later, the judges had no choice. Daniel Cormier had arrived. But not everyone was impressed. The fight wasn't flashy. There was no brutal knockout, no highlight reel moment. UFC president Dana White called it hugging, and the critics questioned whether Cormier had the finishing instinct to be a true star. That doubt only fueled him. He took one more fight at heavyweight, dismantling Roy Nelson with ease, proving once again that his skill set was untouchable. But he wasn't here to clean out the heavyweights. He had already made his decision. The weight cut would begin. He would suffer, he would shrink, and he would force his body into a new division. Because at light heavyweight, the greatest challenge of his career was waiting. Jon Jones, the reigning king, had already started talking. The world wanted a war. Cormier was ready to give it to them. The descent into darkness. Daniel Cormier had fought giants in the heavyweight division, but now he was stepping into an even deadlier battlefield. The light heavyweight division was ruled by one man, Jon Jones. The undefeated champion, the prodigy, the fighter many called the greatest of all time. But Cormier didn't care about reputations. He didn't care about hype. He had only one mission: drag Jones into deep waters and drown him. But before he could claim his shot, there was a problem: the weight cut. At heavyweight, he had power, size, and endurance. Now he had to shed 40 pounds to make the 205-pound limit. It wasn't just dieting, it was suffering. Training became torture. The sauna became his second home, and the scale became his enemy. His body screamed for mercy, but his mind had already made the decision. No turning back. And when he made his light heavyweight debut, the world saw a new version of Cormier, leaner, meaner, and just as ruthless. The first test? Patrick Cummins, a man who had once trained with Cormier and claimed he had made him cry in wrestling practice. That was a mistake. The fight lasted 79 seconds. Cormier smashed through Cummins like a wrecking ball, making a violent statement. "I don't belong here. I belong at the top." The message was clear. The light heavyweight division had a problem, and its champion, Jon Jones, was about to find out just how dangerous Daniel Cormier really was. The collision course. The moment Daniel Cormier entered the light heavyweight division, a storm began to brew. And at the center of that storm, Jon Jones, the undefeated champion, the UFC's golden boy, the man who had ruled the division with an iron fist. But Cormier wasn't just another challenger. He was an unstoppable force with a personal vendetta. This wasn't just about a title. It was about respect, about proving that Jones wasn't invincible. And Cormier had been waiting for this fight for years. Their rivalry didn't start inside the octagon. It started in a quiet hallway back in 2010. Jones, young and cocky, had approached Cormier, unaware of who he was. "I bet I could take you down," Jones smirked. Cormier, an Olympic-level wrestler, was stunned. Who was this kid? That moment planted a seed of hatred that would grow into one of the most bitter feuds in UFC history, and now with Cormier marching toward the belt, the war had officially begun. Chaos before the war. The trash talk escalated quickly. Jones mocked Cormier's height, his age, his credentials. Cormier fired back, calling Jones a fraud, a fake champion, someone who had never faced true adversity. The tension reached its peak at a UFC press event. As they squared off for photos, Jones pressed his forehead against Cormier's. Big mistake. Cormier shoved him back, and all hell broke loose. Fists flew, cameras crashed, security scrambled. The fight had already begun, months before they would step inside the cage. The UFC wasted no time. Jones versus Cormier was set, the champion against the undefeated contender. A legacy was on the line. But Cormier wasn't just fighting for a belt, he was fighting for something deeper. For every setback he had suffered, for every loss he had endured, for every time life had tried to break him, the world was about to witness a war. But was Cormier truly ready for Jon Jones? The breaking point. The anticipation was suffocating. The UFC had built it up as one of the most intense rivalries in history. Daniel Cormier, the relentless challenger, against Jon Jones, the untouchable champion. Every stare down, every press conference, every interview only added more fuel to the fire. But behind the scenes, Cormier was in agony. The weight cut had drained him, the mind games had exhausted him, and deep down, he knew. If he lost this fight, his entire legacy could crumble before it was even built. Fight night arrived. As Cormier walked to the octagon, his heart pounded, but his resolve was unshaken. This was his moment. The first round started, and the two gladiators clashed. Cormier pressing forward, Jones countering with precision. It was a war of wills, a battle between two of the most gifted fighters the sport had ever seen. But as the rounds wore on, Jones did something no one had ever done before. He broke Cormier. The takedown specialist was taken down. The relentless pressure was reversed. The fight slipped away. By the time the final bell rang, Cormier already knew his dream had just been stolen. Picking up the pieces, the decision was announced, unanimous. Jon Jones was still the champion. The undefeated streak, the momentum, the destiny, all shattered. Cormier stood in the octagon, eyes filled with emotion, trying to process what had just happened. He had given everything, pushed harder than ever before, and still it wasn't enough. Was Jon Jones truly unbeatable? Had Cormier reached his ceiling? The doubt crept in like a slow poison. But champions are not defined by their losses. They are defined by how they rise. Cormier could have faded away, could have accepted that he would never be the best. Instead, he made a decision. If I can't take the belt from Jon Jones, I will take everything else. The light heavyweight division was about to feel his wrath. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The path of destruction. Losing to Jon Jones could have broken Daniel Cormier. Instead, it ignited something terrifying. If he couldn't have the champion, he would become the executioner. The rest of the light heavyweight division? They were now his prey. His first target. Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, the most feared knockout artist in the UFC. A single punch from Rumble had sent men into oblivion. But when they met inside the octagon, Cormier refused to be hunted. The fight started like a nightmare. Boom! A right hand from Rumble detonated against Cormier's skull, sending him reeling. For a brief moment, the world thought it was over. But then, something unbelievable happened. Cormier smiled. He absorbed Rumble's best shot and marched forward like a man possessed. The tides turned. Cormier dragged Rumble into deep waters, drowning him with suffocating pressure. Then in the third round, he locked in a rear naked choke. Rumble tapped. Daniel Cormier was the new UFC light heavyweight champion. The throne was his, but the king he truly wanted to dethrone was still out there. The shadow that wouldn't leave. Cormier had the belt. He had beaten Rumble. He had crushed Alexander Gustafsson in a 5-round war. He was defending his title like a true champion. But no matter how many victories he racked up, no matter how dominant he was, there was always one name that haunted him: Jon Jones. The world refused to forget. Every win came with an asterisk. Every interview came with the same question: but can you beat Jon? Cormier tried to silence the critics, tried to build his own reign, but deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't the true king, not yet. Jones had been stripped of his title due to outside the cage scandals, but he was still undefeated. He had never been beaten. And the world wanted to see one thing: the rematch. Cormier versus Jones 2 was inevitable. There was no escaping it. The only question was, would history repeat itself? The ultimate reckoning. The rematch was set: Cormier versus Jones 2. For redemption, for legacy, for the chance to erase the nightmare of their first fight. Cormier was no longer the same man who had lost before. He was the champion now, stronger, sharper, and more relentless than ever. But Jon Jones, he was still the ghost that wouldn't die. Even after suspensions, controversies, and scandals, Jones remained the dark force looming over Cormier's reign. The buildup was venomous: insults, threats, personal attacks. Cormier refused to call Jones a champion. Jones laughed and called Cormier a fake king. But there was no more talking to be done. The cage would decide everything. Fight night. The air inside the T-Mobile Arena was suffocating, heavy with anticipation. Cormier walked out with the belt wrapped around his waist, but he knew it wasn't truly his until he defeated Jones. The first round was a war. Cormier pressured forward, forcing Jones into dirty boxing exchanges, landing shots, proving that he was not the same man Jones had beaten before. The second round was razor close. Every move was a chess match between two of the most brilliant fighters in history. But then, the third round came. Jones took a step back, set his feet, and threw the one weapon Cormier never saw coming: a left head kick. The same shot that had shattered dreams before. It landed flush. The fall of a king. Cormier staggered, legs betraying him, the world spinning around him. Jones, the predator he was, pounced like a lion sensing weakness. A brutal flurry followed: knees, punches, elbows. Cormier collapsed, unable to defend himself. The referee rushed in, stopping the fight. It was over. The arena erupted, the echoes of Cormier's screams lost in the chaos. Jones stood over him, arms raised, victorious once again. History had repeated itself. The belt that had once been Cormier's was now wrapped around the waist of the one man he could never defeat. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, had been torn away in an instant. Had he been chasing an impossible dream all along? Tears welled in Cormier's eyes as he struggled to process the loss. The crowd cheered for Jones, but the cameras captured something else. Cormier's heartbreak. In the post-fight interview, he tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I trained so hard for this," he whispered, the weight of 2 defeats crushing him. Was this how his story ended, as the man who could never beat Jon Jones? The whispers began. Was Cormier truly great, or was he just a champion in Jones's absence? The pain of that question was worse than the head kick itself, but deep inside, a fire still burned. If he couldn't be the best at light heavyweight, then there was only one place left to go. Back to where he belonged. The return to the throne. Defeat could have been the end. It should have been. Twice, Jon Jones had shattered Daniel Cormier's dreams, and now the whispers were turning into roars. He was never the real champion. He could never beat Jon. The loss haunted him, but then something happened. Fate intervened. Jones, his greatest rival, was stripped of the title due to another scandal. The belt was vacant, and the UFC, knowing there was only one man worthy, gave Cormier a choice. Reclaim what was taken. But was he truly ready to wear the crown again, knowing the shadow of Jones still loomed over him? Cormier stepped into the octagon against Volkan Ozdemir, a vicious knockout artist who had made a name for himself by putting opponents to sleep in seconds. Many believed Cormier was too broken, too mentally shattered to withstand another war. But Cormier wasn't there to survive. He was there to remind the world who he was. From the opening bell, he took control, suffocating Ozdemir, dragging him into the deep end, and finishing him in the second round. The referee pulled him off, and just like that, Daniel Cormier was once again the UFC light heavyweight champion. The belt was his, but something inside him whispered, this wasn't enough. There was still one more mountain to climb. Chasing immortality. Light heavyweight had been his battlefield, but it was never truly his kingdom. The shadow of Jon Jones had tainted it, poisoned it, made every victory feel hollow. If Cormier was ever going to silence the doubters, he had to do the impossible. He had to move back to the division where he once ruled. But this time, he wasn't just fighting anyone. He was going after the most dangerous man in MMA, Stipe Miocic, the reigning UFC heavyweight champion, the man who had defended the belt more times than any heavyweight in history, the greatest heavyweight of all time. Cormier had spent years at heavyweight, but this was different. He was no longer a challenger. He was a legend now with everything to lose. The critics said he was too small, too slow, too old. But Cormier had heard it all before. This wasn't about size. This wasn't about power. This was about destiny. If he could win, he wouldn't just be a two-division champion. He would become one of the greatest fighters of all time. And so, on that fateful night, he stepped into the cage one more time. Not to prove something to the world, but to prove something to himself. The night that changed everything. The octagon door closed. Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. The greatest heavyweight champion against the relentless underdog who had never truly fit the mold. The air was thick with tension. The world doubted Cormier. Too small, too slow, too outmatched. But what they forgot was that Cormier had spent his entire life proving people wrong. The bell rang, and Stipe came forward, his boxing sharp, his size imposing. He was the natural heavyweight, and he fought like it. But Cormier? Cormier had a plan. The first few exchanges were tense. Stipe landed clean shots, but Cormier didn't back down. Instead, he stood in the pocket, absorbing the power, analyzing every movement, and then, in the clinch, he found his opening. A short, brutal right hand. Crack. Miocic's body stiffened, his legs buckled, and the heavyweight champion collapsed to the canvas. The referee rushed in, waving it off. It was over. In a single moment, Daniel Cormier had done the impossible. He was now the UFC heavyweight champion. He had conquered both divisions. He had defied every expectation. He wasn't just a champion anymore. He was one of the greatest fighters in history. But just as he had reached the top, the whispers returned. There was still unfinished business. The ghost that wouldn't die. Cormier stood in the center of the octagon, two belts draped over his shoulders, a double champion, a legend. But before he could celebrate, the questions started. What about Jon Jones? Even at the highest peak, his greatest rival still loomed over him. Jones was gone from the sport, for now, but Cormier knew better than to believe it was over. And so, he made a choice. He wouldn't wait for Jones. He would write his own ending. First, he defended his title against Derek Lewis, dominating him with ease. The victory was satisfying, but something still felt incomplete. Cormier had climbed the mountain, but he had one last fight left. Stipe Miocic wanted his revenge. And in the heavyweight division, there are no guarantees. Miocic was not just coming to reclaim his title. He was coming to end Cormier's story once and for all. The rematch was set, one final war. Would Cormier walk away as the greatest, or would his reign end in heartbreak? The final chapter. The night of the rematch had arrived. Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic, 2-everything. Cormier had already cemented his legacy, but legends don't just want greatness. They want dominance. He wanted to retire on top, to silence every doubt, to prove that the heavyweight throne belonged to him. The first round started, and Cormier looked untouchable. He picked Miocic apart with crisp strikes, controlled the pace, and outclassed the former champion. It was happening. He was going to defend his title, retire as the greatest heavyweight ever. But then, Miocic made an adjustment, and everything changed. The fourth round began, and Cormier still looked sharp. But Stipe, the relentless warrior that he was, had found a weakness: body shots. He started ripping vicious left hooks to Cormier's liver, over and over, like a man chipping away at a fortress. Crack. The pain shot through Cormier's body, slowing him down. Another shot, then another. The champion was crumbling. Miocic saw his opening, swarmed him with punches, and suddenly, Cormier was on the mat. The referee stepped in. It was over. The belt, the reign, the dream. All gone. Cormier sat in the octagon, the same look in his eyes as the night he lost to Jon Jones. Was this it? Was this how his story ended? He could barely see, his eye damaged from an accidental poke, his body battered, his legacy on the line. Reporters asked about his future. Would he fight again? Would he chase redemption? But deep down, he already knew the answer. Some battles aren't meant to be fought forever. He had nothing left to prove. He had been an Olympian, a double champion, one of the greatest to ever do it. And so, Daniel Cormier walked away from the sport, not as a man who had lost, but as a legend who had given everything. The world of MMA would never forget his name. The king had fallen, but his legacy would stand forever.